Hello and welcome to another bonus episode of Why Haven't We Solved It Yet? A podcast where we deep dive into issues around the climate crisis. In this episode, we discuss eco-anxiety, especially faced by young people while trying to talk about issues of climate change. I talked to Stephen Kirk, who is an undergraduate student of development studies, and Dr. Kate Russell, School of Education and Lifelong Learning. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, both of you. It's a pleasure to have you both here. I think we'll just dive straight into the question. So let's start with you, Stephen. As a young person in undergraduate, doing an undergraduate degree, what inspired you to think about eco-anxiety?
Great question. I'm a bit older than my peers, and growing up, I had kind of grown up around kind of the climate kind of ecosphere and understanding it as an issue. But I was always just on the kind of external boundaries of it. I never dove in. So growing up, I kind of thought about it a bit more, especially when I was looking at my degrees at university. I saw what I'm doing now, international development and the environment, and its ties with climate change. And I thought, okay, I need to learn a bit more about this before I pick. And I dove in a bit deeper, read some books, did some research online, looked at the IPCC reports and articles around those. And it just kind of led me into this state of doom and gloom. And that wasn't really healthy for me. So as a response, I think, from myself, I backed away from it. And I just thought, okay, that's enough for now. I might learn the more positive sides in my degree and can look at responses and action later on. But I was in that state of just kind of numbness from it. And eventually, coming into my degree, I looked at responses that we have and the things that we can do to act. And that, in reflection, I looked back and I was like, I was really, learning about climate change led me to feel really anxious. And all my peers around me, my friends, my other students on my course are going through that same kind of process in a way. They're all learning about climate change. And it's not a very positive subject when you're taught about the potential futures. And it's scary and it does get overwhelming. So I thought, okay, how can I help my friends and my other colleagues and students to kind of overcome their emotions or help manage them a little better, or turn those emotions into forms of action. But that's kind of where it dove in. It was on reflection of myself, I think.
Wow, that's a great answer. And before we respond or dive into that, I would like to ask Kate. Kate, how did you get into the area of mindfulness in general and then looking at sustainability or eco-anxiety?
Well, I came to mindfulness probably about 10 years ago, just for my own practice, trying to support my own kind of well-being at the time, going through a couple of difficult things. And a staff course was run at my previous place where I worked. And I just found it incredibly valuable to me. It really helped to shift the way in which I related to the difficulties that I was experiencing. So I found it really an empowering type of process for me. And then coming back to the UK, I was really keen to explore more about mindfulness and how to develop my own skills, but also then to perhaps to teach it to others. So I found a teacher training programme at Bangor University that has been supporting my teaching practice of it. And I've been offering that 8-week courses here at the university over the last sort of 3 or 4 years to staff and PGR students. So that's kind of really... And I continue to practice that now for myself, and I've noticed how it totally supports when I'm approaching different types of difficulty. So whichever that might be, work, personal, in relation to other things that are kind of happening in the world, those sorts of things too. So my connection really is through mindfulness, generally as a pedagogical practice to support well-being. But also now, I suppose, in relation to things like eco-anxiety and climate change, it's also just the other things that are happening kind of around the world at the moment. It's really interesting to see how it's being used as a way to support social change, to allow people really this sense of opportunity, that there is a sense of agency that's possible, that you don't then get subsumed by all of the things that are kind of happening and get kind of really squished in and held really tight by the things that are really pretty nasty out there. And for me, mindfulness is not about saying that the thing that's out there doesn't exist, or it's not real, or, you know, you shouldn't be worried about it or just put up with it. But it's about accepting those things kind of as they are and using that as a starting point for then thinking about ways in which you might want to support change for yourself or for others. So lately, over this year, I've been working with some people in the outreach programme here at UEA. We've been looking specifically about how we might address eco-anxiety for younger people in schools. So used mindfulness skills to develop a kind of a sort of a mini workshop to explore how anxiety materialises itself, and then how we might be able to use some of those mindful skills to relate to it in a different way that gives a sense of opportunity for agency, rather than going, I can't, it's too big, which often that kind of feels like when you have experience a form of anxiety, that there's that paralysis that kicks in.
Right. So it's an arsenal to fight, like a personal shield. Mindfulness is supposed to be.
I guess you could. That's quite dramatic, but
I am dramatic.
No, that's fine. Definitely, it's a way of approaching your interactions, I think, that you have, and in particular, it's the way in which you relate to the experiences there, rather than that kind of reluctant, passive acceptance around things that are really difficult, and learning how to just put up with stuff, you know. So I think there's that sense that it has more active elements to it in that process. So it's not like in a work environment where perhaps you might just be guided to find ways to build up your resilience in a way to be able to put up with the things that aren't too good. It's not about that. It's about kind of going, here are the things that aren't too good. In what ways are we able to relate to things differently that can be more supportive for me? But you're right, it is an arsenal.
So and you said it's crippling, and I think crippling is the word Stephen also. So is this how it manifests itself? In the sense of you don't want to go out, or you want to stay in cocooned?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that eco-anxiety, as in other forms of anxiety, are fairly similar in what they produce in the person experiencing them. So it might just be that for an person experiencing eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, however they might want to phrase it, their focus of their concern might be kind of slightly different than others, but definitely that sense of overwhelm. In particular, I think with eco-anxiety, there's this sense of powerlessness, helplessness about being able to do anything about it, because it feels really, really big. You know, it's the planet rather than, say, this one assignment I've got to do today. So it can feel like it's too much to kind of manage. So I don't know if that's your sense.
I would agree. I think it grows and it stems from learning about it in a very negative way, because you can learn about climate change in a way which provides forms of agency, rather than just learning about the science and the potential futures. For example, you learn about the potential actions and responses that as a collective people can take, or people can collectively do things differently, that you can help others around you to change, and they can help others. And it kind of, if that's taught in a way which activates response, whilst also learning about the future, it's I think that leads to more change. But there is going to be that anxiety as well, which comes alongside it, because you're not always acting, you know. Even if you do teach ways of or pathways to action, there's still going to be that kind of like cloud above you, in a way, kind of that will come back eventually, but in a way that supports action and continued action, because you have moments of optimism and moments of anxiety, I think. Or that's from my personal view anyway. And without those, there's going to be that balance, and it kind of helps you respect when you are doing action more, because you look back and you think, oh, I was really anxious, but now I'm acting, and action feels good.
Right.
And that drives more action.
Let's talk about, where is this feeling of helplessness coming from? And I'm going to bring in a previous episode where I was interviewing Asha, and I have a catchphrase, a question I ask all my guests, which is, why haven't we solved it yet? And Asha said, well, we have solved it. We know what we have to do. We just have to go and do it. And at some point, he also says, I think we're ready for the next generation to come up and take action. And I think the way he meant it was that he wanted to include the next generation in the conversation. But a lot of people, so I've had two kinds of response from that answer. There were young people who were saying, well, it's this generation that has caused all the problems, and now they want us to solve it. And then there was this bunch of people who were like, okay, at least now we are being involved in the conversation. So do you or your peers also feel that you're being excluded from the narrative? Or do you think it's a burden that's being passed on to you? Can you speak to this thought?
Yeah, I can't speak on behalf of all my friends,
Yeah.
but from myself and what I would like to think my peers feel is that when it comes to the conversation around climate change, you look at the political side and the governmental politics, and in our country, for example, young people aren't represented to what I would call a fair extent. You've got people under 18 who can't vote on things that they might find important, even if it's a smaller vote. I'm not going to get into that, but their voices aren't heard from that political level because then they're not old enough, and that shouldn't be something in the way of them taking action. So I think in a way there's more opportunities for us as young people to stand up and take action, but it's not done in a way which is necessarily fully political. It's more, you see it with Fridays for Future, with like forms of non-violent direct action and protesting, for example, or putting posters up or things like that are kind of responses to that level of unrepresentation in governance. But I would like to see more young people. You look at COP and the recent COP in Glasgow, and yes, there were young people who were represented. You had Greta and lots of wonderful, incredible speakers and young people who were representing the youth of the world, which was incredible to see them all come together. But you look at the responses, and it kind of seems that, yes, we are going to be the future. And we are the future governance. We are the future voters. And that is power, but that's ahead of us. That's not now. And what we need is more action now. So more non-violent direct action, like protests, more collective responses to climate change, like changing our diets for a more plant-based, as I would call it. It doesn't mean completely cutting out meat, because some cultures have it. But in my mind, it's a privilege to have that choice. But you look at the midst of, at the moment, with the current energy crisis and food crisis, and everything's getting more expensive. And so those options seem less of an option now, especially as students. But yeah, I think to kind of summarize, young people voices are being heard more, but whether or not that actually action is being taken on them is questioned, I would say. Because we're getting more representation at a global level in newspapers and governance. But actual action coming from those words being spoken is, I would say, is yet to be seen at the moment. But the fact that voices are there now is something to be excited about, because those young people are going to be the future leaders. They're going to be the future policymakers. They're going to be the future in governance. And that's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to that.
Okay, that's a great answer, and I personally agree with you that there is a bigger and bigger void between rhetoric and action, which worries me a lot. But on this, well, same question but slightly framed differently. We had this discussion about youth feeling left out of the conversation with Esther in one of our previous episodes. And she said that one of the things that media is reflecting now, especially media targeted at younger people, is that you have these apocalyptic-like movies and zombie apocalypse, or if it's Marvel, and then there is no hope. And then at some point, some little tiny corner, there is some sense of hope in there, in a message. And I don't know, Kate, if you feel that as young people are coming to talk to you, there is one of the manifestations of eco-anxiety, is it also lack of hope?
I think that's really true, and I think that's where we need to be really, really aware of the way in which we approach talking about some of these things sometimes, because without that sense of hope or a possible future or a future selves that they can see themselves kind of there, that it can be entirely kind of disabling in a way, that there's kind of almost like and then what's the point? You know, what's the point of trying to do anything when there isn't going to be anything to kind of work towards? So I think there's that balance about, I think it's so important to be able to hear directly from younger people's views about their perspective about what is the difficulty at the moment, and what is being heard by the grown-ups around, whoever that kind of might be, and an acknowledgement that their voices are valuable, and that they're equally as valuable as the people who are in charge of how much money is spent on those sorts of things. And I think that's where, again, I guess some elements around like mindfulness teaching can be really, really important, because it allows the acknowledgement of the absolute direct experience of that concern and worry and anxiety in whichever ways it kind of manifests itself. But then it also provides this option of like, and within all of that, there is a space for you to be able to kind of go, actually, okay, and I can then do something else after that, rather than the kind of the falling off the edge and the catastrophizing kind of element of it, that it allows the possibility to kind of go, wow, there's anxiety, there's fear, there's frustration, there's worry, there's panic, whatever those feelings might be, but it's not necessarily here in me. It's a reflection, almost like a standing behind the waterfall of all of these emotions and worries and stuff that's kind of here. So this process, which is like called decentering, where those deeply held emotions or experiences of anxiety can be separated a little bit from the actual direct experience of the individual, so that you don't say, I'm just an anxious person, there's no point me doing this. It's kind of like, wow, okay, anxiety's here again. I'm experiencing it in all of these ways, but it's kind of here. And this distance then gives you that space to be able to make a choice about going, okay, there's anxiety here. I can do this, kind of in response to that. So it can help to create this sense of, just a bit of a gap that allows a bit of autonomy, a little bit of choice. And then in that choice gives that greater sense of freedom to be able to take some action. So there are ways in which you can work with individuals who experience all of those things. So I guess it's just about being really mindful about the ways in which those things are kind of being taught, because otherwise, why wouldn't we all think that there's no point, because, the world is a disaster type of space. But actually, a bit like you were saying earlier, when you're worried, it might motivate you to do something about it. And actually, there's still plenty of wonder and joy and wonderfulness in the world that we have at this moment that we can use as a starting point to continue that. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, that can feel totally disarming, and you kind of learn that helplessness in some way.
Beautiful words. I'm already feeling very good. But Stephen, can you speak to that? So how did you deal with, you've spoken about the problems and how overwhelming the problem this was when you learned more and more about climate change. And it's something everybody, including this podcast, is guilty of, talking about it. How did you deal with this?
Yeah. So one of my things that I dealt with, like the way that I managed it was, I'm a very outdoorsy person. I love nature. And just sometimes getting away and just enjoying nature for what it is, and kind of like reminding yourself how important it is, but not in a negative sense, in a beautiful sense. You go outside and you just look at the sunset or hear the birds, you hear the water, and just all wonderful parts of nature, and you look at that, and it's kind of like a reminder for myself just to take a deep breath and realize that I can't do everything there needs to be today. I can't do everything to solve the crisis, but I can do my bit. And I think if more people look at it in that way, as in it's not your full responsibility to, you can't do everything, you really can't, but you can do something. And that's kind of something that I remembered when I went outside in nature and enjoyed the outdoors and the beauty. I just got reminded, I can do something. I don't need to do everything. And just that reminder really helped manage those emotions. And nature is healing, I think. It's you go outside, you get away from all the screens, social media, and it's peaceful. And you need that kind of balance between super hard work and learning about climate change and going outside and just enjoying nature and being reminded why you're doing what you're doing.
Oh, I have very verbose guests today. But I think what you're speaking to is the decentering process that Kate spoke about. So that's, you were very, what is the word, ahead of your age. Okay, so what I'm getting is that there's a lot of information and we have to see how we disperse this information, how we talk about the issue of climate change. But I guess people who talk about politics or social commentators are going to be are going to argue that, well, this is really the reality, right? So we have to talk about the reality. Which brings us to the question that Freddie, one of our producers, had suggested. How do we know? I mean, I'm not suggesting either way, but is eco-anxiety really a mental health issue? Or is it a way of, as Friends of the Earth say, a rational response to the kind of information overload that we see today? How do you see that, Kate?
Well, I'm not so sure that they need to be different, that they could be both of those things. That absolutely, I think having worry about what's happening in the world, that seems like, we do need to be that. We need to be really aware of kind of what's going on. So I think having that as, having worry as a rational response to the situation, I think is kind of to be expected. And I guess that's a hope, actually, that we should all be at least a little bit worried. Otherwise, then nothing will kind of happen. I think it really is a growing mental health issue because it's becoming a stronger focus for people's connection with the world. I think the danger that comes in around with different types of misinformation that can then lead on that if your worry starts to get a bit more, you can almost develop some cognitive distortions with that where you might have a sense of, this is a bit problematic, and then something else that you might read might add that on, and then something else, and then something else, and you can end up with this kind of like big whir of like what we call like ruminations, which are the thought processes, the negative sort of thought process that can make it feel like all of a sudden like nothing else can happen. You're completely overwhelmed. But from what we know about, research, and there's an interesting work came out of Australia quite recently that around about 70% of the students that they asked, they weren't at school, they were kind of more like university age, were kind of recognising that they had experienced some form of kind of climate worry. Not all of them would develop kind of levels of anxiety where it meant that they weren't capable of doing anything else, like even getting out of bed in the morning. But I think we all need to acknowledge that this is a real thing. But there is a difference between worry and then anxiety that creates these other kind of levels of manifestations that means that you can no longer engage with kind of your world because you're so constricted and straitjacketed by it. But that's my sense of it.
Mm-hmm. And Stephen, you had a project recently where you asked people to chalk down their thoughts to express how they feel the anxiety. Do you want to talk about it?
Absolutely, yeah. It was loads of fun, and it was really good to see how the students and participants were getting their thoughts out. The premises was around, we did some emotional well-being, like in a workshop where we helped people to just listen to their emotions when they think about climate change and try and just get them written down on paper, just get them from the mind and the body onto some form of physical sense. And then we went around the campus with bits of chalk which washed away in the rain, but we got it out, and we went around to loads of different parts with chalk and wrote down what we put down on the paper and put it in big words onto big bits. The campus here is full of concrete, so it was perfect for that form of non-direct and non-violent action, and really good for getting that representation of emotion out, and something that other students were able to go out and they could see, oh, I'm not alone. You know, they can go out and they know that they might be worried about climate change. They might not be at that extent of anxiousness, but it's that feeling that you're not alone, which I think is also something that people need to remember. Like, we're all experiencing climate change, and we all will, and we need to manage it together. And I wanted to help remind other students who didn't maybe participate in the workshop that they can take action and that they're not alone. So it was fantastic. We got loads of pictures and everybody had a really nice time. We're looking to do it again, but soon, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think we'll try to link the pictures in the description of the podcast for everybody to see. But I think what's really nice about this exercise is that it brought people together to not feel alone. And that is one thing I have a sense that that's what mental health issues do. They make you feel that you're alone. You have to deal with this on your own. It's like Stephen versus Earth and all the evil governments of the world. So there is definitely a sense of isolation. And especially, I think, after COVID, when we were in like home prison for, 2 years, and then there is a war going on very close in Europe, and all these things together can be very perplexing for everyone. So, and I think the one thing, Kate, you said about recognizing, taking cognizance of the problem, that it is a problem, because mental health issues are still stigmatized in many places today. So there is. I mean, I feel bad for some of the young people today carrying this burden and then being stigmatized for carrying this burden. So I don't know if you want to speak to this issue of stigma being around it, and how can we help take it away?
Yeah, I mean, definitely from my perspective, allowing this greater sense of, talking about the different types of practices that you might do. So for me, I try and meditate every day. That really helps with my practice, to allow myself to just notice what's going on for me on a day-by-day basis, to allow myself to kind of check in, really, those sorts of things. But I think in particular with this scenario around the eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, it feels like, from the research that I've read as well, and like from talking to younger people that I kind of know, that there is this real sense of like, when they say, oh, I'm really kind of worried, there's often a really dismissive approach of kind of like, well, look, it's not for you to worry about. You just get on and stay at school and do all those normal things, and it's not for you to kind of worry about. I know that in some places, again, in Australia, actually, context, there was a move to try and actually remove some of this stuff from the curriculum, because it was creating, or the perspective was that it was creating this level of anxiety, so they didn't want to talk about it. But you can't. Living in ignorance is not a good plan, is it? Mm-hmm. So I think that sense for younger people, kind of being told, isn't that kind of sweet that you're getting worried about the planet, that sort of patronizing level, just removes their sense of agency in at that level, so that when they get a bit older, they may be like, well, what is the point? Who is really listening? Mm-hmm. So I think sort of the connection then to being aware of like mental health issues and how we can do it is to give space to hear those voices. So like you were saying kind of earlier, how important that is, and to allow that recognition that actually this is really hard to deal with. And like what you said, we've had the pandemic. We've just, going into a war in Europe, and then this is still kind of present. It's like, that's hard for anybody to have to try and manage. And for young people who've experienced time away from school and all that type of stuff, all that disruption, why wouldn't they be experiencing a greater sense of, I haven't got a clue what's going on, because they've not had that sort of stability in some way.
Yeah, that's, it's a hard time for anyone. And specifically what you said about being condescending and patronizing, that's very important, because speaking to the experience at COP that Stephen was talking about, I know that even Greta's speech at some point was, a lot of people were like, oh, it's very sweet, but, you're so young, and do you even know what you're talking about? Which is, it's not a very nice thing to say to anybody, and especially to young people who are going to have to face these issues at some point. It's terrible. So,
and was she wrong? I mean, did she say anything that wasn't right? I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? Just the perception of this being in front of you and then attaching value and all that type of stuff is just interesting, isn't it? And the dismissiveness of her. Like, did she say anything that actually wasn't
exactly?
true
Yeah.
at that point?
And I mean, I wanted to throw in a bit of anxiety issues that, well, maybe slightly older generation, but still young adults are feeling these days about talking about raising kids, or will they even have kids? And a lot of people are having this conversation about should we do it? Is it the right thing to do given the kind of resources that are needed? And I spoke to this one scientist and he said, well, not having kids is one way of extinction of the human race, the other one being climate change. So I don't know if you have, both of you actually, let me throw this out to both of you. Have you thought about these issues, or have people come to you talking about the next generation that you want to bring in?
I will speak from some experience. I worked with XR a little bit, and one of the local participants, a young woman, is taking part, and she won't have children until she's done it, until she knows that the future is climate secure. And I think that serious dread of anxiety has led to that, and it's kind of led on to we're never going to fix it type of thing, kind of mindset. When in reality, I think when you look at it from an optimistic point of view, if you have a child, then you will do everything you can to make sure that they've got a good climate secure future. But there's still that anxiety alongside it. There's some papers have written around responses to climate change, and they say, one of the most controversial papers says, stop having children. That's the best thing that you can do. But realistically, you look at where the global population is heading. We can see it's heading to peak around 10 billion. That might sound like a massive number at the moment, but we're reaching about 8 billion now, I believe, and it's only 2 more billion. I say that like it's a small number, but from a global point of view, we can now, knowing where the population is heading, we can plan for that, and we can also understand where the areas are vulnerable. We can look at areas that we need to mitigate and areas that can develop for the best response for the climate crisis, because adaptation is needed, and both of them are both needed, because responses, like the climate change is locked in some parts.
Yeah.
But we're still releasing carbon dioxide, and we're still contributing to it. But the population debate has been going on a lot around climate change, and limiting maybe families to one child might help that in a way. But we are a human race, we want that freedom, and we deserve that freedom in a way. But there's a lot to talk about. But from my own point of view, I want children someday in the future.
Yeah.
At the moment, I'm not in that space to do so. But I wouldn't stop. It's one of those things that's in my head. Part of me says, "Oh, you should you should never have children."
Yeah.
And the other part, that's the very pessimistic side, the anxious side. But then the optimistic side, and the side where I'm aiming for, and wanting to go, the pathway, the future I want to see, means that I want children, and I'm very much leaning that way. I'm trying to push for it as much as I can, and it's that kind of balance you've got to get. You need to recognise that anxiety is there, and that's telling you, oh, don't have children, or have only one child or something. But realistically, you're going to want children in the future. Some people might not. That's okay. But myself, I'm trying to look at it from an optimistic point of view, and I think you've got to. Family is and children is quite a difficult topic to debate, but or talk about. But I can understand why people don't want children. But I also think that they need to try and work and do their best to try and stop climate change as they can, and then they can have children, you know, and they lead them into a world, and they can be an idol for their children as well. And that's something that I want to be for my children. I want to say I've done my bit and I've done my best, and I want you to carry on that legacy, because it will continue. Climate change, it will take a while for the temperature to go back down. It will. And my children will be in that world. But I want them to look back on me and think, oh, my dad, he did a good job and I want to be like him. And if we all turn into that individual where we aim to be the change, then our children will be thankful for us. And at the moment, my parents didn't look at climate change and see it as an issue. They weren't taught about it like I was. And therefore, I can't blame them for the situation that we're in. I look at the governments and oil companies, I can blame those, you know, and I can be angry at those, and that's a understandable response. But me as an individual, which is what I can control, I think we need to aim for that positive approach for not just for us, but for our children, and the future generations as well.
Yeah. I think this very Malthusian thought of like, oh, we're reaching limits of Earth, and it's I'm not saying it's not valid. It's a valid, not scientifically, but I mean, in our brains when we're talking to ourselves, sometimes it's a valid thought to have. But I don't know, when people try to bring these to political spaces, it can be very, very alarming and dangerous actually sometimes. This is used often in India, where I'm from, as like, oh, we're overpopulated and that's the problem. Whereas there is like a huge young population that the problem actually is that we're not equipping them to deal with the problems. Kate, do you also want to speak to this issue?
Yeah, I mean, good on you, Stephen. That's really good. Right. Kids will be very proud of you. And stuff. Yeah, and I think, I mean, I was really drawn a basic kind of what you were saying. There's something in those ideas around controlling population which feels very colonial in some way. This kind of sense that we might make decisions, like your description of India, for example. This kind of sense when we know already that things like climate change affects different people in really different ways, and therefore people who are much more likely to be affected by both climate change explicitly and then other forms of like mental health that related to that are most likely to be double the vulnerable people. So when we kind of say let's all just have one child, it's like it's not a recognition of the social and cultural context that people will live in. It's not as straightforward as kind of saying that. Damien Barr, who wrote some really interesting work around the COVID pandemic about what can we do and all this type of stuff, and I love the way he said it. You know, often everybody kind of goes, "Oh, we're all in the same boat." You know, we're all part of this thing. And actually, he was going, "We're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm of COVID, or like now the sort of climate change. But actually, some people are in super yachts, and some people are in a dinghy with one oar. So it's not the same for everybody. So when we're talking about these changes that might need to happen or responses to them, we have to acknowledge where we, you know, who's making these decisions, what framework are we laying on these other people, and then those perceptions around the value of one child versus 2, 3, 4, however it kind of might be. I think that seems really important to at least acknowledge somewhere in all of this kind of dynamic, the worry that becomes behind certain directives. You know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be asking places like perhaps India to look at different ways of using their fuel, for example, but you can't blame them for kind of going, oh, hang on a minute, you've had your go, now we need to be able to develop ourselves in particular ways that, you know, the West have done or something. It's a really difficult tension, isn't it?
Heavily like debated around that, and when you look at it from an ethical point of view, with ignoring future impacts of climate change, and the future contributions to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and greenhouse gases. If you ignore that, then yes, that country or any developing country should be able to use the same fuels and techniques that we did. But we as a country have, I would say, more of a moral right looking ahead at the future, especially to develop cheap alternatives to what we used. So cheap green energy and pathways to that, helping to fund research in those developing countries on responses for mitigation and development, because populations are growing, as we have been talking about. But those countries are going to be facing energy issues and security issues, food security, water, all of these security issues just for basic needs. And for those countries to have that response without releasing more greenhouse gases emissions are vital. You know, some say, I would like to see our country do a lot more, a lot quicker in order to provide more carbon dioxide, because you have nationally determined contributions for carbon emissions. And if we cut ours down drastically, it means that we can provide space for more buildings. So concrete is a big emitter for carbon dioxide, and it's something that's very hard to replicate or find an alternative for at the moment. There's research going into it, but it's costly. And all these countries with these new cities and big cities which are growing populations, and like such as India with their giant populations, which is wonderful to see. It's that they're facing challenges with housing and access to water and electricity and food and all that infrastructure, which is vital for a city, which is where a lot of people are moving to. Urbanization is growing, and it's the fastest kind of densely populated areas in the world. But we from an ethical point of view, I think the UK should cut our emissions much quicker and provide those carbon emissions and say to other countries, here's some of our carbon emissions that we would have used. Please use them to help develop mitigation techniques, like to help protect them against bigger storms, which are because of our like industrial revolution and our history, which needs to be accounted for that climate justice sense. But if we do it, all the other countries which have caused climate change have to do it as well.
It's very true.
But I guess it's one of those things. We're following the pack at the moment, and we need to kind of take a step away from the main path and kind of do our thing for what is right and just for the world.
We had an episode on this where Dr. Salim Hulhaq from Bangladesh, he spoke about how we're not really in the same boat. We're in this, well, I'm paraphrasing now because Kate has given me this wonderful phrase. We're in the same storm. And he talks about, in that episode, he talks about not just mitigation, but how Bangladesh, for example, is way ahead in adaptation. And countries like Germany and UK must try to learn from what they have done. But before we move on from the question about children, I just thought I'll give a little disclaimer. In our conversation, we are not subscribing or trying to prescribe anybody to have children or not have children. If you choose you do not want, that's also fine. If you want, that's fine. But we're trying to just address the anxiety surrounding this already loaded question. So let's now start concluding our thoughts. Stephen, you also spoke about a project that you're doing about connecting different students. Spoke prior to the recording. So do you want to talk about that project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I part of my project with the chalk last year was in response to a course that I was doing with an organisation called Turning Green. And I've worked with them a little bit since, and now we are doing some research globally, as many schools as we can, so hop on board, send me an email. And the research is being done targeted at students, but also teachers, to gather kind of like an idea of how much they understand climate change and in what ways, so if it's a human or scientific way, and the depth of that knowledge, but also how that links to the emotional responses and how people feel, and then also the interlinks with both of those to if people take action or if they want to take action. And at the different schools, it allows us to, with the information, to connect individuals together within their own school or within their own country, or interculturally and between different countries in order to bring them a sense of action and provide them with resources to take action. And you're going to have different challenges all over the world. And different responses to those, because they all vary. You know, in like the university, we've got different things in Norwich, and then you've got other things on the other side of the world. And like in Bangladesh, they've got an amazing response to climate change. But the schools and young people, which are the future, need kind of, I think one of the issues is the access to action. When you've acknowledged those emotions around climate change, there's often they build up, and in my mind, that's what happened with me. They build up, and those emotions build up until you find a pathway to action. And I think the research is going to be providing and helping to provide those pathways. And yeah,
That's
to be done in Earth Month as well. So it should be, touch wood, really good. Yes.
I can see Kate nodding along.
Really good. Well done. That's great.
Well,
Very stressful.
high praises. And Kate, for you, I thought the concluding question would be something like, Stephen also touched upon young people from different countries who are probably facing the question of climate change in different ways. So when we think about it, we need to have empathy. And then you also spoke about the process of decentering. So is it possible to do all of this together, to feel for others, feel for us, and then also have a decentering?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, immediately that comes to mind, there are a number of like kindness practices that we do, which sends kindness to people that we know and that we love, to ourselves, which can often be the hardest thing that we want to do, but that we can also send that kindness out to people that we don't know very well. So I could do that to you guys because I've only met you today, to our wider community, and then to places around the world, but then also to like to the earth and the planet and the living things that are on that planet. And that might sound quite fluffy and quite esoteric or something like that, but actually the practice itself is kind of acknowledging the power of that sense of kindness and compassion that you can send out. So rather than calling this eco-anxiety, we might call it eco-compassion. We might call it eco-empathy, which then gives a different lens to action that might be possible. That when you're worried about this, it's because you have that empathy with the wider planet that we all kind of exist on. And there are lots of other types of mindfulness practices as well. In particular, for me, like the mountain meditation is so powerful because it's about being grounded to the earth and the places beneath you. So when you were describing, you know, how you're being in nature and just that moment, I love that. That's like total being present, which is kind of like the key cornerstone really of mindfulness, but about it coming back to that each time to kind of go, I'm here, you know, we are here, and we can use that then as a place to kind of start from. But I think there is absolutely that capacity to change the way in which we relate to emotions, from going, I am anxious, to there is anxiety here, and that space then gives that bit of time, that pause, to then go, okay, I'm acknowledging that this is here, and now what do I want to do? And that's the agency that's right there. So having examples like Stephen's work to go, okay, you've got to that point, great, well, I can give you some ideas then about what you might want to do. Sounds awesome to me.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great advice from both our guests. And at that note, maybe we should wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Stephen and Kate, for this very engaging discussion on how to deal with anxiety around the climate crisis. I welcome you all to practice decentering and let us know how you feel. This episode also coincides with the launch of a groundbreaking new project between UEA mental health charity Mind and the Climate Psychology Alliance, which will help students at UEA turn negative feelings about climate change into positive action. You can find out more about the Sustain project and sign up to take part at uea.ac.uk/climate-change/ecoanxiety, or click the link in the description to this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and you can listen back to all 7 episodes from Series 1, including Episode 5 that focuses on activism with Dr. Esther Priyadarshini. Until then, I hope you still have hope.